Thank you so much for coming today. We really appreciate you taking the time. My name is Amy, and this is Shirley. We're both members of the Community of Living Traditions, which is an affiliate member of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, one of the sponsors of this press conference. And Shirley is also a member of the Muslim Peace Fellowship, which is another sponsor of the press conference.
Thank you, Amy. So we're calling this press conference today because of the intensifying crisis in the English-speaking region of Cameroon, called by the local peoples Ambazonia, has brought together a new global coalition calling on the UN Human Rights Council to immediately send a high-level fact-finding delegation to investigate the abuses. Our primary goal with this request is to reduce the violence and save lives. We believe that an HRC-mandated fact-finding mission would have the immediate effect of quelling violence on the ground. An HRC-mandated fact-finding mission is necessary because the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has twice requested access and been denied by the Cameroonian government. That is why we have written a letter to the UN HRC, which is being delivered today. You can find this letter on the second page of your press packet. The signatories of this letter are part of an emerging global initiative to end the Cameroon colonial conflict. It includes prominent peace organizations like the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, faith-based groups like Pax Christi and the Dennis Hurley Peace Institute, and grassroots human rights organizations like the Cameroon-based Network of Human Rights Defenders in Central Africa, better known by its French acronym REDHAC. Amy?
So today we're going to hear from three speakers who are going to help us unpack the urgency of this that's behind this request. First, we're going to hear from Eben Egbe, who is an Ambazonian living in exile in the United States and also a spokesperson for our coalition. And he is going to talk a little bit about the current state of things on the ground in Ambazonia, southern Cameroons, and also set the current crisis in a historical context. And after that, we're going to hear from Reverend Dr. Emma Jordan Simpson, who's the director of the United States branch of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. And she's going to speak as a Baptist minister about the role of faith-based organizations and the importance of a nonviolent perspective in helping to solve this situation. And finally, we're going to hear from Professor Matt Meyer, who is speaking on behalf of the International Peace Researchers Association, and he's going to talk about the media and human rights reporting environment, which has been shaping our understanding of this conflict, and the special role that the UN Human Rights Commission has in moving us forward. So there's more information about each of these three speakers in your press packet. And FYI, there's also bios for the other two press conferences that took place earlier today in Geneva and Johannesburg regarding this same request to the UN HRC, which you can peruse. And also those conferences were recorded online, so you'll be able to watch them as well. We will ask you to hold questions until after the three speakers, and then we'll be happy to take questions. Thank you. Evan?
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Shirley, and thank you, Doc. Thank you, Professor, for being here today, and thank you also for taking the time to come and listen to us talk about this situation happening in this region of West Africa. So I'll start with the numbers. The Norwegian Refugee Council reported in December that the number of people displaced by this particular conflict had grown something like 40% during the months between June and November, a situation that forced the UN to acknowledge that this conflict is essentially one of the fastest growing conflict-driven displacements in Africa. The primary driver of these displacements is the extreme vicious attack of Cameroon forces and the way they target civilian communities, the civilian population in Ambazonia. For example, on February the 2nd, at the funeral procession of the principal of one of the major colleges in Batibo, the Cameroon government troops opened fire at the procession, killing the surviving wife and daughter of the gentleman who was supposed to be buried on that day. The examples abound a lot, but I just wanted to point out that also yesterday, in a market in a city near Kumba, that is, the first example was in the North Zone, and this is in the South Zone. About 14 people were killed in the market when troops got into the market and opened fire at people in the market. And beyond just the coverage on these particular situations, we can see there was a recent article by the New York Times in which they interviewed a couple of witnesses who told this same kind of narrative, this what seems to be beyond just the crime of killing people recklessly without any point, but they seem to have a tenor of the intention of terrorizing the population. That seems to be the goal. It seems to be a malicious goal with the intention of terrorizing the population. And so with that situation and the escalating numbers of victims coming up, I couldn't be more grateful as an Ambazonian to the network of civil liberty leaders and civil society leaders and peace movement that stepped up to join us in this effort to try to get the international community to take the appropriate decisions to try to put an immediate halt to the killings and probably pave a way to peaceful resolution of this conflict. The importance of this particular step for us is far beyond just the immediate escalation of the violence. For us, this is so important as an Ambazonian because our conflict is one of the least known conflicts in the world. But these conflicts have been going on for 3 decades. And the primary reason, I think, is because it remained a peaceful-led process in this conflict. This conflict started in 1961 when, after Ambazonians decided in the wave of a Pan-African storm that was raising the continent to join with their brothers, they came in with their own constitution, their own judicial system, their own parliament, and tried to join with Cameroon to create a bigger zone to ignore colonial boundaries that were built and try to force society together that is focused on their own interests. It just became clear to them that they had miscalculated the political status of Cameroon. Apparently, Cameroon has not successfully decolonized. And so instead of joining fellow Africans to forge a new African, West Africa in which they could defend and define their own future, they ended up becoming sucked into a state of a neo-colonial state. And so that's the onset of this struggle. And that has stayed like that up till when in 2016, the movement, in fact, this peaceful movement had for its slogan, the argument of force and not the force of argument. Because we were so confident of the basis of our legal status, of the international laws binding relationship between countries, that we just couldn't imagine that we're not going to win this case anywhere it was going to go. And it stayed like that. This movement stayed like that, peaceful and forged on for 3 decades. That was until 2017, in October 1, when the government decided to use helicopter gunship to mow down peaceful protesters. That was the first time in the history of the 3-decade struggle that some people in Ambazonia decided to defend their communities with force. And so for us, this opportunity to educate and bring more knowledge and be able to stop the killings and be able to come back into a peaceful resolution is very, very, very important. I would like to say, on behalf of the coalition, we understand the other speakers are going to kind of highlight the importance of the Human Rights Council in trying to come up with mandating a commission of inquiry to go down to Ambazonia and investigate these things. The experience remains that every time the UN Human Rights Commission or any UN institution, the Assembly or the Security Council had mandated any commission of inquiry, that always stemmed the violence down. That's what we need. We need the violence to stop. We need the killings to stop. When it was done in Sri Lanka, the violence went down. Eventually, a solution was sought after that. When a commission was mandated for Burundi, the violence immediately went down. When a commission was mandated for Myanmar, the violence immediately went down. Perpetrators understand that the mandating of a UN institution or a UN or the Human Rights Council, the mandating of a commission of inquiry is a signal that there will be accountability. And that signal is the recent history shows that people respond adequately to. So I will stop there and hope that this is going to be a great opportunity for all involved that would hear this to play their role in trying to make sure that we can stop the killings and eventually resolve this problem. Thank you very much for your time.
Good morning. My name is Emma Jordan Simpson, and I want to begin by saying that the primary reason why we are here today, why we are speaking out today, is because of our shared belief. We live the principles of peace and nonviolence, and it is those principles that require us to speak up in the face of these growing reports of human rights violations, the abuses, the violence, and the killing happening in the English-speaking region of Cameroon, Ambazonia. The International Fellowship of Reconciliation represents 40 groups committed to peace in over 40 countries on all continents, including the United States. We're here today to add our voices, to add the weight, our concern, and the power of our spiritual convictions to this call to stop the violence. We believe that the Ambazonian struggle is a struggle for basic human rights and self-determination, and as such, it is consistent with the International Declaration of Human Rights, and as such, it is our obligation. It is our obligation to stand with the Ambazonian people. The United Nations Human Rights Council has the power to cultivate the conditions for peace. And a Human Rights Council mandated fact-finding mission would have the immediate effect of quelling violence and saving lives. We want the UN to know, as leaders of faith and conscience representing groups across the world that are deeply committed to the creation of peace and justice through the transformative power of nonviolence, we're doing more than praying. We are monitoring the UN's action or inaction. We know that the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has twice already requested and been denied access by the Cameroon government. We must now mandate and dispatch a fact-finding mission, because time is of the essence and lives are at stake. And this should happen during this 40th session, which begins later this month on February 25th. I want to be clear that we are not a partisan group. We are interfaith, we are spiritual, we are committed to the principles of nonviolence, we are committed to the principles of peace and justice. And we're standing here on those principles with the peacemakers in the region who are also struggling to end the violence and to save lives. This is important because we want for those who are struggling for peace in Ambazonia to hear our voices. We want them to know that we hear their voices. We want them to see our efforts to amplify their struggle. We want them to know that we see their efforts and that they are not alone. And we will work together, stand together to work cooperatively to lift up our voices until their voices are heard. And I have to say that as a Baptist, I believe in the basic right of all people to have self-determination and to live freely. And adding my voice to elevate this concern for peace and for justice is faithful to the long tradition of my community of not ignoring the cries of oppressed peoples, of refusing to turn away from the violence and the killing, and to keep crying out like Rachel until the violence and the killing has indeed stopped and a way has been made for peace. We will all continue to work cooperatively across the world, and particularly in the region, to lift up the Ambazonian voices. And we stand together focused on an immediate end to this violence, and we call on the United Nations Human Rights Committee to embrace a sense of urgency. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Matt Meyer. I'm the Secretary General of the International Peace Research Association. There is a written statement I'll be reading from, so if folks want to have that, you can have access to that later. It's also here. There is no longer any controversy. Leading British historical and legal agencies, and none other than French President Emmanuel Macron, have equally and recently asserted colonialism was and is a crime against humanity. As such, United Nations protocols empower all peoples and parties to act with the, quote, responsibility to prevent genocide and the, quote, responsibility to protect. It is not so useful in the case of the Cameroons or Ambazonia to spend time debating who is most at fault. Is it the government in Yaoundé or the man Paul Biya, who has been president since I was 19 years old, the longest ruling leader in the world? Is it the original French colonists who, along with their British counterparts, set up this competitive, divided we fall scramble way back when? Is it the UN in failing to oversee the promises made decades ago? Perhaps it's the children of Ambazonia who, frustrated at increasing police and military violence and little to show for decades of completely nonviolent and unarmed actions against their colonial predicament, pick up some stones to defend themselves just over the past year. There is enough guilt to go around, and we say again, it is not so useful to spend time debating who is most at fault. The UN mandated responsibility to protect and the responsibility to prevent genocide, equally, especially in cases of contemporary, ongoing colonialism, is a responsibility of all of us. It is certainly the responsibility of the United Nations member states, with an emphasis on those who currently make up the Human Rights Council, which soon meets in Geneva. But it is also the responsibility of non-governmental organizations, organizations like the International Peace Research Association, with consultative status with ECOSOC. And yes, it's the responsibility of media as well, to remember that even conflicts which appear small in places which are not easily found on maps require our urgent attention and solidarity. We need only reflect on the upcoming 25th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide and the ongoing tensions in the Great Lakes region to be clear about that. I represent a UNESCO-affiliated organization of scholars, academics, researchers, and students from roughly 100 countries in every region of the world. We, of all people, know that the information is neither inaccessible nor in doubt. Despite sometimes misleading reports from even the most reputable and well-known agencies in the human rights field, it is not too difficult to ascertain who is most at risk and who is mostly armed in the northwestern corner between Cameroon and Nigeria. Despite recent news that the US will suspend security assistance to Cameroon because of its poor human rights record, we must not be overjoyed or lulled into a sense of false accomplishment. Our colleague, Adotai Akwe, Amnesty International's deputy director here in the United States, noted yesterday, quote, Cameroonian security forces have indiscriminately killed, arrested, and tortured people, firing on crowds, displacing thousands of civilians, and destroying entire villages with impunity, close quote. Until all that has come to a complete end, calls like this one to the UNHRC, which we sign on to today, are vital in both accumulating incontrovertible information to share with the World Forum and in stemming the tide of violence, at least in the short term. In the long run, we repeat, colonialism was, and in Ambazonia today, colonialism still is, a crime against humanity. Until colonialism is ended, our work will not be complete. Thank you.
We will be delivering the letter to the UN later today. We want the United Nations Human Rights Commission to act during its 40th session, which convenes on February 25th. And I think the way Reverend Dr. Emma put it is perfect. We call on them to embrace a sense of urgency with regards to this situation. Lives are being lost on a daily basis.
Thank you, Amy. So now we will open the floor for questions. Sure, go ahead.
Thanks for doing this press conference.
Thank you for coming.
Can you tell me how you see this situation developing on the ground, what your main concerns are, and what's happening in this part of Cameroon? And then also, besides this letter, have you reached out to any of the member states of the Human Rights Council on an individual basis, and what kind of feedback have you gotten?
Yeah, so to the first question, the development of the situation in the ground, what seems to be happening is what one journalist aptly described as in the local newspaper called The Voice, that there's no community that is untouched. So the government has simply escalated the level of indiscriminate killing. On the one hand, people escape from their villages that are burned to go hide in the bush in the hope that the army can stay away. The army will hunt people down in the bushes. People who are seen in the bushes are killed, and the army says, oh, these are the people who were fighting the so-called armed separatists. On the other hand, people who run to bigger cities and try to hide in homes, they would be very unlucky, because we have a lot of homes where whole neighborhoods, the army break in and people are shot dead in their homes, not in small numbers, but in huge numbers. Then there is the issue of the senseless killing of women and children. So it seems this, from our point of view in the movement, the escalation and the indiscriminate shooting. You have priests being shot at the pulpit, not because soldiers come into their church, but just because soldiers are walking across the street and firing bullets as they go on trucks. We have video after video of soldiers just driving through cities and just spraying bullets as they go. And this is the numbers and the circumstances, and you remember even the testimonies on the Washington Post articles are the same. So as far as the situation on the ground is concerned, the scale of this random firing and the multiplicity of the victims and the seeming indiscriminate character of it and the feeling of impunity of the soldiers seems to be fueling a further escalation of this type of killing. So the situation on the ground is getting worse by the day. Think about it. If you look at the numbers, we had 160,000 refugees. We were all shocked when we heard about that in March. And now we're talking about 500,000 displaced people by this conflict. That is official conservative numbers. If you look at the numbers, we have some comrades on the ground reporting situations of something like between 2 and 3 million people who have been displaced by that. And we have, as last as August, we had the Human Rights Network, one of the organizations, reported 120 villages burnt, right? So the number of villages being burnt is escalating. The number of victims of dead people killed is increasing, but the pace and the tenor of the violence is also exploding exponentially, that people are not just running, but people are running as fast as they can. These numbers of people being displaced is driven by the scale and the ruthlessness of the violence.
So I think if it's okay with you, we'll have Matt address the second question. Is that all right?
Yes,
okay.
Thank you.
We can all stay up here.
Thank you.
There's a reason why, there are some strategic reasons in response to your question why we thought it necessary to have press conferences in New York, in Geneva, and Johannesburg. There are obviously other places, and we have contacts all over the world. The Human Rights Council meets, as has been noted, in Geneva, and that's the center of a lot of this work. So to have our folks on the ground who monitor, who attend, who speak to, provide testimony to that council directly are based there. We're here obviously at UN headquarters, where a lot of information and organizations and coalitions get formed and developed. But the Johannesburg one was a special one because of that member state question. And for us, both the relationship of the South African government's potential for support of these causes, and because of the South African government's relationship inside the HRC, it seemed like focusing in Joburg was of particular significance. I think we don't want to say too much more about that now. Obviously, this process, as HRC meets in Switzerland, in Geneva, is one where there'll be many bilateral and international conversations between NGOs and our friends in different embassies, between the member states themselves, and so forth.
Currently, the Ambazonian people, from what I've been observing, are not very confident of UN intervention in the situation in southern Cameroon. So what is the guarantee that this effort getting through the UN will yield results?
If they will heed results and what those results will be, I can say, having seen what went down in Rwanda and seeing how this violence here in Ambazonia is escalating on that level, to not do nothing what is not an option, right? And it is the responsibility of the United Nations to do something and to keep these kinds of massacres from happening. If the slogan is never again, then it has to be never again for everyone and not just, places where we select. So we're hoping that when they do their job, then the natural occurrence will be that the violence is lessened, and then it's on the agenda so that at least it's on people's radars to know that this is happening and to work towards a solution, right? Because I think the reason that we don't have a solution now is because when it's switched over from the British to the UN and then back to the British and then over to the Cameroonian government, people just kind of dropped the ball because of different reasons that were convenient for them. And what we're saying is you cannot drop the ball on this, right? This has to be fixed, especially because you have men, women, and children dying. You have all these massacres happening. And we can't keep allowing these genocides to happen in Africa because it's easier to turn a blind eye because of resources or because we want to sell arms to people. So, sorry.
If I may just add one more question so that it can tie it together. The Cameroonian government have also refused every fact that has been put out there by, whether it's even video, the Cameroon government have refused. They have this tendency of just coming out and saying, what you see either on social media or on other news stations, they are all lies. With your ministers come out and say all of this. So do you have data that will back up this request as well? So I'll just add that to the question.
Yeah, I don't think we'd be here if we didn't have data, and we've also provided lots and lots of additional information in the form of fact sheets and links and research that's been pulled together. There is no denying what's happening, and I really want to echo my sister's voice. The question that you ask about the lack of confidence that the Ambazonian people have in the UN right now is exactly the reason why we're here. Yeah. This has been going on for a long time, and no one has been listening. And what we've decided in our coalition and all of the groups that we represent across the globe is to say we are going to lift our voices until the UN hears their voices. And we're not going to stop until there has been a way made for peace in Ambazonia. We will not leave this issue alone, and we will not let them stand alone any longer.
Other questions? Yeah.
Just wondering, will you guys have video of any of the other events in Johannesburg and Geneva made available?
Yeah. The South Africa, the Johannesburg press conference, I believe it was live streamed on SCBC, which stands for Southern Cameroon's Broadcasting Corporation, which you should be able to find on through their Facebook page, and I'm pretty sure it's archived there, right? Okay, and this press conference also will be archived on SCBC's Facebook page. As for the Geneva one, I believe that was held at the Press Club, and I believe that the Press Club itself recorded it and will make that recording available, but I don't have the details on that. It could be that SCBC Facebook page has that one as well. So that would be your first go-to. Thank you. Other questions? Yeah. Thank you.
The organization consists of about 40 countries, I believe. Is Cameroon or one of such countries? I know it's a faith-based, but is a faith ministries in Cameroon part of this organization?
You're asking, are faith organizations in Cameroon a part of this coalition? That is a really good question. Does anybody want to take that, or should I try to take that? So not officially yet, but we did have some informal consultation with some of the organizations that either have ministries in Cameroon before we launched this effort, to make sure that it was consistent with their impressions of what would be helpful. But I think our feeling was that for safety reasons, it wasn't necessarily something that we should prioritize to headline those on-the-ground organizations, and so we did not even make requests to those organizations to be involved. Not that we don't want them to, but that our primary goal in pulling together this coalition was to pull together allies and put them in touch with the grassroots human rights organizations and the diaspora organizations. So we do have two of the leading signatories to the letter are human rights grassroots human rights organizations based in Cameroon and Ambazonia, and then we also have a number of diaspora organizations that have been involved deeply in shaping this. What I mean by diaspora organizations is Ambazonian people that are living outside of Ambazonia, outside of Cameroon. But it would be really great as a next step to reach out to the faith communities in Cameroon and Ambazonia. So thank you for raising that.
We should be clear that as a coalition, this is the first press conference we have put together, the first action, this call to UNHRC. It's not the last. So we expect to be reaching out to all of you, and we expect all of you, including those who hear this or see this online, who have access to media, whether personal and social or public and global and everything in between. We ask you and invite you to continue to reach out to us as we monitor the situation as international NGOs focused on human rights, peace, nonviolence. We will be responding and reporting to you and to all of our networks throughout the globe on the UN's reaction, HRC's deliberation, and our next actions. So indeed, this is, in some ways, for us as a coalition, just the beginning, although the people of Ambazonia have been struggling about this and on this for decades. Just also reiterating my colleagues, you talked about guarantees, and of course we know there are few, if any, guarantees in this life. But one is sure, we can fairly well guarantee what will happen if we do nothing, if we say nothing, if we report nothing. So it is our obligation, as all of my colleagues have said, to make sure that that option does not take place.
Do we have any final questions or comments? Thank you all for coming, and you can find further information in the press kits and further contact information. Thank you so much.